Today we'll be reading from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 to 20. Beginning with verse 15, Re'eh nathati lefanecha chayom. This form Re'eh at the beginning of the text is fairly straightforward. It's a call imperative, masculine singular. Notice the schwa under the resh. The tsere he is characteristic of third he verbs. So this is from ra'ah, the verb to look or to see. I think probably the most important thing to understand about this particular form is its function in the grammatical context. Here, this is functioning as what grammatically we would call a focalizing element. That is to say, that it serves to focus the attention of the reader on a particular thing. And in this case, the particular thing is defined by what follows. So, look here, pay attention, note well. These are all potential ways that we might translate this. So he's not calling upon the reader to physically, to actually literally look at, but rather to pay attention to what he's about to say. So he says, look here. Nathati, this is a call perfect from the verb nathan. Notice that the second nun has assimilated because it has a schwa beneath it, and so it's assimilated into the tau that follows. So Nathan, first person, I have put lefaneka before you, chayom, today. Now here, Moses is talking about what he has already told them. So in order to get the sense of this, we probably need to do a quick review of what has happened in the section preceding this passage. What we have in this section is the ratification of the covenant that God had made with them already back in Exodus chapter 24. So here, in reviewing that, we get instructions at the beginning of chapter 27 regarding the memorial and the altar, but the main part begins with the presentation of the alternatives, the blessings and the curses, the blessings that will be associated with their keeping the covenant, the curses if they rebel against it and reject Yahweh their God. Chapter 29 then gives us a prophecy of the future where they're warned that failure is on the horizon, certainly a real possibility for their future. This is not fanciful, this is reality. And even so, God says that he will not abandon them. He puts before them the promise of restoration in the future and renewal, even if they do fail. But he wants to encourage them to be faithful, and so in our section here, God sets before them a choice of life and death. So in our passage, Moses begins by reminding the people of what he's already told them. He has set before them today, so far, eth hachayim wa'eth hatovah, wa'eth hamaweth, wa'eth hara. Now, all of this is really a object. This whole clause presents us with the object of the verb nathan. What is it that God has set before them? And notice the structure of this grammatically. Es chayim va'es hatov. Literally, the life and the good. The question is how we should understand this. Do we understand this as the good life, or the life which is good, versus the bad death? Well, let's look at the way this is put together. We get es hachayim wa es hatov. If we're inclined to take this in an adjectival way. These need to modify, the adjective needs to modify the noun, but does it? Chaim is masculine plural, hatov is masculine singular. So they don't agree in number in this case. Also, another factor here is the repetition of the definite direct object marker, eth, and the fact that it has a conjunction on it. If this was an adjectival phrase, you wouldn't have either of those things. So this is not really an adjectival phrase. It represents two different things. What has God set before them today? On one hand, he set before them life and that which is good. And then on the other hand, here the alternative indicated by the wow here, wa'eth hamaweth, wa'eth hara, and death and that which is harmful. Evil is a possible translation here for ra, but that implies we're just talking about moral stuff. God isn't setting evil before them as a choice. Rather, he's setting harm, that which is bad for them as a choice. So I would personally avoid the translation evil in this case. Turning from verse 15 to verse 16. Asher anoki b'tzawaka hayom. The first question is what we're going to make of this asher. Now, everyone knows asher introduces relative clauses in Hebrew. That's its main function. The question is that its function here? Now, the fact that this is a problem is signaled to us by the existence of translational alternatives. So the Septuagint actually adds a bit of text before the word asher here that's not in the Hebrew text. It reads, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, and then the asher introduces a clause modifying commandments. And notice the ESV does kind of more or less the same thing. So it's assuming that something has dropped out of the text here. Well, it's not impossible by any means, and it would allow us to take the asher as a relative clause, which is its primary function in biblical Hebrew. A second possibility is not to take the asher as introducing a relative clause at all, but to take it as a conjunction, introducing a final clause or an explanatory clause for the purpose of. If you look this up in the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, this would be usage 4C for the word asher. So it's a little bit down the list, and it's certainly not common, but it also does occur other places as well. So if we take asher in that way, then we don't need to add any text before this. Rather, it introduces an explanation. Why should they do this? Because I am commanding you today. There is yet a third possibility, however, and that is to take the asher as introducing a relative clause, but a relative clause that's the object of what follows, rather than a relative clause that simply modifies what precedes it. In this case, we might put a period there and translate something like, what I'm commanding you today is, and then finish the sentence. So this is what we would call a leading relative clause, a relative clause that precedes rather than follows. Most relative clauses are trailing relative clauses. That is to say, they modify what is before them. And in English, they would be sentenced something like, the man whom I saw went to town. In the relative clause phrase, whom I saw, modifies the word man. It comes after, so it's a trailing relative clause. A leading relative clause comes before what it modifies. And to stick with this won't be a very good English sentence, but it does work. We could rearrange the words of that previous sentence to read, Who I saw was the man going to town. That puts the relative clause before the word that it actually relates to in the main clause. As I said, that's not really a very good example. At the very least, we'd probably say what I saw instead of who, even though we're talking about a person. But nevertheless, that's a reasonable example of the difference between leading and trailing relative clauses. In this case, we could take the asher as introducing a relative clause, which is its main function still, but we just have to understand that the relative clause is in front of what it's referring to, not following what it's referring to. In that case, we wouldn't need to add this phrase that the Septuagint and the ESV adds at the beginning. And frankly, that's the way that I would take it. So I would translate something like, what I am commanding you today is, to supply the word is there, and now continuing with the next clause, Lahava es Yahweh Eloheka laleketh b'darakau, is ahava. This is from the verb to love. It's infinitive construct, call infinitive construct. Notice it's a little bit of an odd form with this ah on the end of the form. But if we look this up in the lexicon, we will see that the call infinitive construct of the verb to love, aha, occurs 17 times in the Tanakh, and 14 of them are in this form. So this longer form of the infinitive construct with this ah at the end is actually the norm for this particular verb, rather than the standard ahov, which would be what we would kind of expect based on the paradigm. So here's a case where we have a variant kind of form, but it's not really as rare as we might think that it is. So what I'm commanding you today is to love Yahweh your God, laleketh b'darakau. Now the question here is how we're going to take this lamed. We could take this the way we took the previous lamed, to walk in his ways. Another possibility is to take this as a lamed of product, a lamed of means, with infinitive construct, to love Yahweh your God by walking in his ways. The lamed of means used with an infinitive construct indicates the way that another action is performed. In this case, you perform the action of loving Yahweh your God by walking in his ways. So that's another possibility. This could be a second thing that's being commanded, or that God has put before them, to love God and to walk in his ways, but we don't actually have a conjunction there, so we'd have to be adding something. The next clause continues the same thought. Well, lishmor, again we have the lamed there, perhaps, and by keeping his commands and his statutes and his mishpatau, his judgments. To carrying on. Wahayitha wa rabitha. Question. What is the function of the wow here? Well, in this case, I would argue that this is not just another thing. We don't have an infinitive construct like we've had in the series, but a second person perfect verbal form. So I would take this wow as resultative. That is to say, this wow introduces the result that will come about as the outcome of their doing what God had commanded. So you will live. So you will love the Lord your God by walking in his ways, keeping his commandments and statutes and judgments, with the result that you should live and rabitha, and multiply. Here, remember that this resultative use of wow is not all that uncommon, actually. We don't typically call it to people's attention when they're first learning Hebrew because they're struggling with enough as it is. But if we think about the use of wow in verbal clauses, just in verbal clauses, not in other kinds of clauses, but in verbal clauses, the three most common functions of a wow are simply to introduce the next thing that happens in the sequence of events, and, or then, what we call circumstantial, that is to say, indicating the circumstances in which something happens. The circumstances are sometimes temporal, so we might translate it when, or wow can sometimes be translated like since, or given that. And the third main grouping of usage is the resultative, introducing the result of a previous action. And that's the use we have here. The result of these other actions is that they will live and will ravitha, and will increase or multiply. And now here we have another thing introduced, and another result. Here, this form, Barak is a PL perfect from Barak, to bless. Yahweh, your God, will bless you in the land, Asher ata ba shama larishta, in the land which you are. Ba is a call participle from bo. The same form could be the call perfect, but that would work grammatically here, so it has to be the call participle, not the perfect third masculine singular, which you are entering thither, shama, sham there with a hey directive on it, larishta, to possess it. So the hey directive on the end of sham with the idea of entering, and then larishta, I've already mentioned, was the call infinitive construct. The lamed preposition on the front in this case indicates purpose. The purpose for which they're entering into the land is to take possession of it, or to inherit it. So we have the on the end, which is the object suffix. Notice this particular Comet's hay has a mapik, or a dot in the hay. That tells us that it's an object suffix, it referring back to the land, which is feminine. So turning to verse 17, we begin with a conditional phrase, Wa'im yifaneh levavka. If yifaneh is a call imperfect, third masculine singular, from a third hay verb, pana, segol hay, is characteristic of the ending of third hay verbs in the imperfect. So call imperfect, third masculine singular, from pana, to turn. The subject is levavka, a heart is masculine in Hebrew. So if your heart turns, here this next phrase, walo tishma, and you do not listen. In the context of the preceding verse, this kind of suggests that we should take this first wow not as conjunctive, but as disjunctive. But if your heart turns. And now what about the wow on lo? I would take this as a resultative wow. If your heart turns, and as a result of your heart turning away, you do not shama, you do not listen, or in this case probably shama in the sense of obey, wa nidachta, and this verb I think deserves some conversation for us. We looked this up. It would tell us that this is a nifal perfect second masculine singular from the root nadach. But let's focus on this for a moment. If we try to parse this verb, we see the hirik under what appears to be the first root letter, and a doubled middle root letter. and the pathak in the theme vowel position. And our instinct would be to say, this looks like a PL perfect, second masculine singular, ta ending. It looks just like the paradigm form, kitao ta. So since that's the case, why, if we look this up, do the resources tell us that this is a default perfect? Well, the answer is in the use of this particular verbal root. This verb occurs 53 times in the Old Testament. Of these 53 times, it never occurs in the PL and only once in the pual. So this verb is used almost exclusively in the first verbal stem called nifal, not in the second PL, pual, hithpael. And because it simply doesn't occur there, while this form that we have in front of us, didachta, could theoretically be a PL perfect, second masculine singular, it's much more likely to be a nifal. So why does it look this way? Well, you remember what happens in the nifal, the form would look like this. The nun of the verb would be preceded by the nun of the nifal. The nun of the verbal root would have a schwa beneath it, and when you get a nun with a schwa beneath it, it's often going to assimilate, which is what happens here, and it shows up as the dagesh forte and the dalet. So didachta shortens to nidachta. So nifal perfect, second masculine singular from nadach, to go astray. So if your heart turns away, with the result that you do not obey and you go astray, and what else? You go astray, wa hishtachawitha. This is a hishtapel perfect, second masculine singular, from the root chawa. This root means to bow down or to worship, to do obeisance, literally to bend down and touch your forehead or nose to the ground, or nearly so, bow down, most often in a kneeling position. If you look this work up in older resources, you might find it parsed as a hithpael from the root shakha, with the same meanings. The problem is that when older resources were written, we didn't know what this word was. So if we look at it, the yod clearly tells us that it's third hay. This yod before the consonantal ending is a clear indicator that this is a third hay. So chawa would be third hay, shakha also third hay. So that tells us that the hay is there. That's not a problem. The challenge is the wow. If this is from the root shakha, this is a hithpael of shakha. And by the way, the idea of the hithpael would be that the shin of the root and the tau of the hithpael have metathesized or switched places. This does happen when you get dentals and sibilants together. They sometimes switch like this. So that's not all that problematic, even though it requires some explanation. The thing that is problematic is the wow, because if this is from the root shin chet he, then there's simply no possible way to explain where this wow comes from. So the root has to be chet wow he, chawa. In fact, we know this now from Ugaritic parallels, but even if we didn't, a clear, careful look at this form would tell us what the root at least has to be. So not from shakha, but rather from chawa. But this raises the question of what is a hishtapel. We don't see this elsewhere. You're familiar, of course, with a hay prefixed form like the hiphial or the pael, with these hey prefix forms. What you may not know is that in other Semitic languages there are alternatives to these hey prefix forms. So, for example, in Aramaic, there's a haktail, which would be the equivalent of the hifil, but there's also a shaktail, which the shin takes the place of the hay. There's also a shithkatail, which is simply, shall we say, an alternative to the hithpael. There are also forms where there's an aleph instead of a hay or a shin, so there's an ithkatail in Aramaic as well. But there are also some forms where you get compounds of these things. And so we know, again, from Ugaritic that there are some forms, rare that they are, where you get a compound of both of these prefixes. So you get the hay and the shin prefixed. So hish tafel is really just an alternative form of the hithpael that occurs occasionally. In biblical Hebrew, the hishtafel only occurs with this one particular word, chawa, and this word, chawa, always occurs in the hishtafel. So it's a bit of a sui generis. It's one of a kind. It causes problems because it was misunderstood earlier in the 20th century when they didn't know about this occurrence that we get in Ugaritic. But even so, it's clear that it has to be from chawa because of the wow in the middle of the word. So in any case, it means to worship. So if your heart turns and you do not obey, and you wander and worship other gods, lelohim, acherim, and serve them. And now let's continue on with verse 18. And the reason we have to consider these two together is, remember we said at the beginning of verse 17 that im introduces a conditional sentence. It introduces what in grammar we would call the protasis of the conditional sentence, the if part of the if-then sentence. So if these things happen, and now the then part, the apodosis, as we call it grammatically, is normally introduced by a wow in Hebrew. We have several wows in verse 17, and we might, as we're reading along, have to consider whether one of those wows introduces the then part of the condition. But looking ahead, it does not. The then part, the apodosis, is introduced in verse 18, higadti. Now notice there's no wow on this form. This is what in grammar we call asyndetic. That is to say, it doesn't have the conjunction that we would expect to find here. So this is an asyndetic condition where the apodosis is not introduced by a wow, as it most often is. It's just one of those things that happen. So not particularly problematic, although it may cause us some difficulty in reading until we get used to seeing it. So if all these things in verse 17 happens, then what will happen? Higadti lakim hayom. God is speaking, remember, and he says, I, hear the hifil from Nagad, I declare to you today. And what is it that God will declare then? That key introduces indirect discourse in this case. I declare to you today that avod tovedun. Avod tovedun. Avad, the verbal root aleph, beth, daleth, means to be destroyed or to die or to disappear. Avod is a call infinitive absolute. Tovedun is a call infinitive construct, second masculine plural, with an enclitic, paragogic nun on the end, form lengthening nun. So what will happen? God declares to you today that surely or certainly or utterly you will die or disappear, be destroyed, perish, perhaps another possible translation here. You will be completely destroyed. Remember, the infinitive absolute, when it precedes a finite verb, either indicates the certainty of an action, you will surely or certainly, indeed, it will happen, or it indicates the degree that something will happen to the fullest possible degree. You will certainly, so either you will certainly be destroyed or you will be utterly destroyed. Either one of those meanings fits the infinitive absolute before the call imperfect. So you will, I'm inclined here to take it as degree. You will be utterly destroyed. V'lo ta'arikun yamim al ha'adamah. Ta'arikun, from the verb arak, to be long, and the kun on the end. Notice the kibbutz here. This is defective spelling for the shurek. So think of this kibbutz as just a shurek written differently. So this would be second masculine plural. Again, we have the paragogic nun on the end that doesn't really affect the meaning of the form all that much. This is Hiphil imperfect, second masculine plural. So the subject is you, the people to whom God is speaking. You will not, and here, make long. You will not lengthen or prolong yamim, days. In English, we'd probably add a suffix here to make it sound a little better. You will not lengthen your days upon the land. So, in other words, they won't live the long time that they hope to upon the land. The land is modified by a clause beginning with a share, a relative clause. The land which you are crossing, Eth HaYarden, the Jordan, Lavo, to enter there to possess it. So, turning to verse 19, God says, Ha'idothi bakim hayom et hashamayim wa'eth ha'aretz. Ha'idothi is a Hiphil perfect, first common singular. God is speaking, and it comes from the verb ud, ayin wow daleth. In the call, this verb means to bear witness, a hollow verb. In the Hiphil, to summon or to call as witnesses. So God is speaking. He says, I will summon as a witness bakim. Now here the base is used in what we would call an adversarial sense. I will call to witness against you, hayom, today, et hashamayim et haaretz. I will summon the heavens or the sky and the earth to bear witness against you. Chaim v'hamaweth nathati lefanecha habracha v'hakalah. I think we have to kind of put a period after heavens and earth there and begin a new sentence, probably here at this point, probably the way that it makes the most sense grammatically in English. We finished that thought. If they fail to be faithful to what God's commanded, he will summon the heavens and the earth to bear witness against them. Finish that thought, and now pick up a new thought. Going back to what he has set before them earlier. Chaim v'hamaleth nafati lefanecha, life and death I have put before you, and now kind of and a positive, really, almost to that. Habaracha v'hakalala, the blessing, habaracha, and the haklala, the curse. So God has set before them life and death, otherwise blessing and curse. V'barachta b'chaim lema'an tihyeh ata lezarecha. So here the wow, again, I think introducing a resultative clause, a result clause. God has set life and death, blessing and curse before them. So, consequence of that, so barachta, choose b'chaim. Here the base, we had an example just a moment ago of an adversative base. Here we have an example of a different use of base marking the direct object. So choose life, b'chaim, b'ma'an, in order that you may live, ata lezarecha, you and your progeny, your seed, that is to say in the collective sense of descendants, so your progeny. Turning to the last verse now, verse 20. L'hava es Yahweh Elohecha. Again, we have the question of how we're going to understand the lamed here. This lamed and the next two in the next phrase. I think, again, probably the best way to handle this is to take these as other examples of the lamed of means. By loving Yahweh your God. So how do you do this? How do you accomplish what God has said? You do this by loving Yahweh your God, and by Shema B'kolo, by listening to or obeying his voice. And notice the base B'kolo is again marking the object. By listening to his voice, and by L'dav Kabo. Here we have a less common word, davak, which means to hold on to something, to hug something, or to cleave onto it, the old-fashioned word. The lamed preposition, again, indicating the means by listening to his voice and by clinging to him. Notice this is another example of a call infinitive construct with this on the end. We saw one earlier. In this particular form, there are three occurrences of davak as call infinitive constructs in the Bible, and all three of them have this longer form, if you will, of the call infinitive construct with this on the end. So an alternative that occurs with certain verbs in certain forms for the infinitive construct, that is. So, do this by loving Yahweh your God, by hearing his voice, listening to his voice, and by clinging to him. And the base again here marks the object in each of these cases. Kihu chayeka v'orech yamecha. Because, here ki indicating the explanation or purpose, because it will be chayeka, it will be your life. This will lead to life for you. And orech yamecha, and here this is a noun, length of days, literally. So many days, long days, a long period of days. Length of days is a little hard for us in English. But this will be your life, and the prolonging of your days, Lashevet el ha'adamah, here an infinitive construct with a lamed on the front, to live upon the land, Asher nishba Yahweh, which Yahweh swore, la'avothecha, to your fathers. Here, avoth, remember, has this form that looks like feminine plural, but it's not actually. Avoth is masculine. Avothecha, to your fathers, namely to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Lateth, infinitive construct of Natan, one of the forms that we try to encourage people to memorize when they're first learning Hebrew because it's fairly common. So to Abraham, to Isaac, and he promised it to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob to give to you. Lastly, we have this pay at the end of the reading, which is in Hebrew called a parashah. It simply is a later scribal addition which marks a break in the text. Technically, we call it an open paragraph division, but it simply marks the end of a liturgical reading, which brings us to the end of our text for today, as we've been taking a look at Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 to 20.